or you can also call it treatment denial through treatment guidelines. So let me start with the why of why Lyme doctors are being systematically put out of business by the government, creating an artificial epidemic. So as we gather here today in Washington, D.C., a presidential commission for the study of bioethical issues has been convened to investigate the scope of ongoing revelations about the infamous Tuskegee Experiment, which ended in the 1970s. In this experiment, 600 or so U.S. citizens in Tuskegee, Alabama were denied treatment with antibiotics for syphilis, a disease like Lyme disease caused by a spirochete bacteria. So what did they learn from the Tuskegee Experiment? Well, they learned how syphilis would destroy the untreated bodies of victims who researchers followed unto their deaths. But I would also suggest that the main thing they learned from the Tuskegee Experiment was how not to get caught again. Dr. Cullen Ross, who obtained thousands of pages of declassified documents, stated that the Tuskegee Experiment established that, quote, a large network of doctors and organizations are willing to participate in, fund, and condone grossly unethical medical experimentation into the 1970s, unquote. Well, curiously enough, the 1970s is exactly when the Lyme epidemic, also caused by a spirochete, began to take off, and the spread of the epidemic was artificially increased by, quote, a large network of doctors and organizations, unquote, conducting what I and others would classify as grossly unethical medical experimentation. As a result of his investigation, Dr. Ross stated, quote, there is no evidence to suggest that the government or the medical profession had any intention of closing the study as of 1972, unquote. So I would propose that the Tuskegee Experiment was never closed. As the small-scale experiment was being wound down, a new phase, Tuskegee Part 2, was being ramped up. In other words, it went operational, and it is the Lyme epidemic. So I propose that this Lyme Tuskegee Experiment Part 2 represents the institutionalization of the Tuskegee Experiment. Instead of preventing patients from seeing doctors outside the CDC-approved system, as in Tuskegee 1, doctors are prevented from treating patients outside of CDC-approved protocols in Tuskegee 2. So this is accomplished through a new trend in medicine, which everyone here should understand, and you probably do already since you're a victim of it, which is the creation and enforcement of treatment guidelines, or what I call Tuskegee guidelines. This is a major shift in the way medicine is practiced that controls how your doctor is allowed to treat you or not treat you. Consequently, whoever creates and enforces these treatment guidelines can control the medical destiny of millions of people. So as a result, America's most egregious example of medical malpractice, Tuskegee, is now an everyday reality conducted on a grand scale and run with the complicity of the CDC and other public agencies which are exploiting the public instead of protecting them. The beneficiary of this Tuskegee Phase 2 is the pharmaceuticals industry, the most corrupt, profitable, and influential industry on the planet. So we have powerful national medical institutions, both public and private, that are supposed to be protecting the nation's health, actively undermining it for experimental reasons. So how is this being done? I'm sure many of you here have heard of the Attorney General of Connecticut, Richard Blumenthal's recent investigation into the IDSA treatment guideline authors. And he found that they and the people that pay them as consultants are profiting from denying Lyme patients effective antibiotic treatments for a spirochete organism. This is done through the insurance system and through the creation of treatment guidelines, or Tuskegee guidelines. Now, this is treatment denial through treatment guidelines. So if you've been denied antibiotics for Lyme disease, you are, unfortunately, a part of this ongoing experiment orchestrated by the CDC and the IDSA. The goal is the same as the original Tuskegee experiment, to monitor untreated victims of the disease so that the symptom treatments can be developed, tested, and profitably marketed. Again, the method that they use is different from Tuskegee 1. It's treatment denial through treatment guidelines. So the Obama administration has rightly convened a presidential commission for the study of bioethical issues. It's ongoing right now to investigate ongoing unethical research such as the Tuskegee experiment. But note this, according to a recent article in The Lancet, quote, in a sign of just how thoroughly enmeshed in medical establishment approval the Tuskegee study was, the Institute of Medicine had to decline the assignment of investigating Tuskegee, citing overlapping appointments in the 1940s between individuals on an Institute of Medicine subcommittee and the NIH study section on syphilis. The fact-finding task has now been transferred to the Bioethics Committee. So the President had to appoint a special presidential committee to investigate Tuskegee-like experimentation because a national independent watchdog agency had too many people involved in the original study. I propose that the same would hold true for the modern Tuskegee experiment, and that a special independent committee is required to investigate this study because not only the CDC, but prominent medical societies like the IDSA and state medical boards have been co-opted by the pharmaceuticals industry and are being used to conduct Tuskegee experiments in treatment denial on a national scale on a daily basis. This experiment is so big it's hard to comprehend, but they rely on your ignorance and complacency to continue the experiment. So we must demand an investigation into Tuskegee Phase 2. So finally, in case there is any doubt, as I stand here in the shadow of the White House, I would like to officially and publicly accuse the CDC, Yale University, New York Medical College, the IDSA, and others with engaging in a 30-plus year Tuskegee experiment Phase 2 with Lyme disease. And I would also request the Presidential Commission for the Study of Bioethical Issues, convened by Obama, to investigate this ongoing experiment so that Lyme patients can finally get the treatments and respect that they deserve. The modern version of the Tuskegee experiment is not only far more widespread than Phase 1, it is far more insidious because it takes place through the creation and enforcement of treatment guidelines, which are rapidly becoming the standard way by which Big Pharma legislates profits through the medical system and the government. We obviously need an independent bioethics committee to follow up on the Attorney General Richard Blumenthal's investigation into how insurance companies are using treatment guidelines written by their consultants to deny people treatment so that the pharma companies can profit from treating the symptoms rather than the underlying infection. Since the CDC and the NIH are involved in coordinating this experimentation and upholding the treatment guidelines, we need to insist on an independent investigation. And we have an opportunity with the ongoing presidential investigation to do that. So I'll say 80 years of Tuskegee experimentation is enough. Mr. President, I ask, stop it now. Please have your presidential committee investigate Lyme disease non-treatment. Thank you.
Yay!
All right, Jerry.